opening the center immediately, staking a claim and preparing rapid development for queenside pieces. Establishing central pawn presence immediately counters white's gambit and opens avenues for rapid piece development. Challenging black's central foothold, this pawn thrust immediately inflames the queenside and contests territory. Accepting the pawn sacrifice initiates a dynamic struggle for central space and opens diagonals for piece activity. Developing the knight here aims to control central squares and prepare for castling, while also potentially pinning the pawn on c4 to its king. Developing this knight immediately secures the e4 square and prepares for pawn recapture, a standard response in this queen's gambit-accepted scenario. Opening the e-file for the queen and bishop, this pawn advance prepares a fianchetto or supports a kingside pawn push, solidifying the center and unblocking development. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, preparing bishop development and king safety. Recapturing the pawn, white solidifies central influence and prepares for swift development towards the kingside. Asserting central presence and creating dynamic tension, black challenges white's pawn structure and opens lines for piece development. Bringing the king to safety amidst the pawn skirmish clarifies white's immediate priorities, preparing to develop the remaining pieces into active positions. Bringing the knight to its natural square, nc6, immediately contests the center and prepares for potential pawn pushes like e5, solidifying black's central presence. Securing the queen on e2 is a pragmatic choice, preparing to connect the rooks and enabling the f-pawn's potential advance, which will simultaneously defend the king and contribute to central pressure. It anticipates black's pawn break in the center and subtly hints at future queenside expansion. Preparing to expand on the queenside, this pawn advance simultaneously prevents white's bishop from easily occupying b5 and begins to orchestrate a more dynamic pawn structure, potentially opening lines for future counterplay. Developing the knight to c3 bolsters the central pawn structure and prepares to contest squares like e4, while also offering potential for further queenside expansion or a swift kingside buildup by connecting the rooks. Pushing the queenside pawn opens up a dynamic struggle for queenside space, aiming to disrupt white's bishop pair and gain a foothold for black's pieces, though it also creates potential weaknesses on the queenside structure. Developing the bishop to its most active diagonal now pressures black's queenside pawn structure and prepares to support a central pawn push. Developing the bishop to this square cultivates pressure along the long diagonal, a crucial element in controlling the center and preparing for future central pawn advances, while also safeguarding the king indirectly. Unlocking the queenside and challenging black's pawn chain, this advance aggressively expands white's influence on the flank, aiming to pry open lines for potential piece infiltration. Accepting the pawn on a4 opens the b-file for your rook, aiming for rapid counterplay and putting pressure on white's queenside. This pawn grab, however, means sacrificing central influence for a tempo, and white will likely seek to exploit the resulting positional imbalances by intensifying pressure on your king's safety or by creating a strong pawn center. Be prepared to defend against white's initiative. Capturing on a4 opens the file for white, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawn structure and potentially disrupt their coordination. The knight, finding temporary refuge, begins a subtle journey toward the kingside, hinting at future tactical fireworks or a repositioning to pressure white's center. Preparing to redeploy the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawn structure and potentially support an advance on the queenside. Unlocking the d-file with this pawn thrust introduces a dynamic imbalance, immediately challenging white's bishop on d3 and threatening to disrupt the harmony of white's queenside development. However, it also opens the door to potential tactical skirmishes around the central pawns and could leave black's queenside slightly exposed if white can quickly exploit the newly created lines. Reclaiming the pawn in the center with the knight immediately simplifies the position, offering a chance to untangle white's pieces and gain a foothold in the liberated d4 square, while simultaneously pressuring black's d5 pawn should they defend it passively. Developing the bishop to e7 solidifies black's central pawn structure and prepares for potential castling, while also bringing a piece closer to the kingside, where it may offer defensive support or participate in future queenside counterplay by offering a piece sacrifice on f3 or g4. Unlocking the d-file tension is the immediate priority here, aiming to activate your rook and generate threats against black's potentially exposed king. The queen sidesteps the looming knight attack, simultaneously eyeing the weak b2 pawn and preparing to connect the rooks, a subtle yet active positioning that hints at future queenside pressure. Unleashing a pawn storm in the center to shatter black's pawn chain creates immediate dynamism. Probing the central tension, black anchors the rook on the open file, disrupting white's queenside initiative and preparing to challenge the d-file's dominance, hinting at a future fight for control of critical open lines and potential threats against white's somewhat exposed king. Shaping the queenside pawn structure with this bishop, retreat aims to solidify white's central grip while preparing for potential pawn advances on the kingside. Black is actively challenging white's bishop and simultaneously preparing to untangle the queenside pieces, aiming to activate the rook on the c-file once the bishop vacates its current post. Sharpening the attack, the queen repositions to a central square, eyeing the d6 pawn and preparing to join the kingside assault while simultaneously pressuring black's queenside pawn structure. A daring centralization of the rook, aiming to leverage the open c-file and pressure white's somewhat exposed king, while simultaneously hinting at a potential kingside invasion once supporting pieces are repositioned. A bold gambit that tears open the center, aiming to expose black's monarch by sacrificing material for dynamic piece play, and an initiative, gambling that the resulting chaos will overwhelm black's developing pieces and less than perfect king safety. An immediate sacrifice of a bishop, offering to trade off a key defender of white's king while opening up tactical lines. This daring exchange attempts to disrupt white's already compromised kingside pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances on the d-file. It signals a clear intent to seize the initiative, even at the cost of material. Sacrificing the knight for the immediate threat to the king creates a dynamic tactical storm, exposing the black monarch while aiming to disrupt black's piece coordination and potentially unleash a devastating attack along the open diagonals and files. Fleeing the immediate storm, the black king seeks refuge, accepting a temporary loss of initiative to evade the aggressive knight's deadly embrace. This defensive maneuver prioritizes survival over counterplay, a necessary concession given the dire tactical circumstances. Snatching the queen with check here is a critical tactical moment, exposing black's monarch to immediate danger while white consolidates their material advantage gained from the earlier pawn sacrifice. The black monarch, having been rudely awakened, now finds itself exposed on the 7th rank, a deeply precarious position begging for immediate attention. Unlocking the queenside majority and consolidating a decisive material advantage, white's exchange of queens dramatically simplifies into a winning endgame where black's king is exposed, and his remaining pawns offer little resistance against the soon-to-be active white pieces. Black consolidates the material advantage, securing the rook for a bishop, a generally favorable exchange in most scenarios, even if it means the queens remain on the board for now. Gaining control of the open files becomes paramount after that exchange, and the rook's repositioning here aims to seize that vital horizontal. Securing the now semi-open c-file with the rook immediately addresses white's centralized queen and prepares for potential pressure against the white king should it remain exposed, while also offering a defensive post should white attempt to push further into black's territory. Unleashing a pawn storm toward the enemy king, this thrust dramatically injects energy into the center, aiming to pry open lines and exploit the currently exposed monarch. The immediate pawn storm on the queenside has now culminated in a structure where black's rook on the d-file is somewhat isolated, but this defensive maneuver aims to consolidate and find active counterplay, perhaps targeting white's now exposed kingside pawn structure. A stunning sacrifice ignites the position, breaking open the kingside for a decisive assault. White seizes the initiative by eliminating the bothersome knight and simultaneously opening the f-file, directly threatening black's exposed monarch. This aggressive continuation forces black into immediate defensive calculations, as the king is no longer shielded by a pawn wall. The resulting exchange sacrifices the f-pawn to gain a critical tempo and access to a vital open file, promising a swift and potentially crushing attack against the beleaguered black king. Expect white to pursue this initiative relentlessly. Recapturing with the rook now frees up the dark-squared bishop and solidifies the center, aiming to regroup and defend against white's aggressive piece play. Securing the king from the open diagonal and potential threats on the g-file is paramount after the recent exchanges, paving the way for a more consolidated middle game structure. Reclaiming the open file offers a vital avenue for the rook, setting the stage for potential counterplay and challenging white's control over the board's central thoroughfares. Initiating a flank pawn thrust to contest the open file and potentially create a passed pawn. Re-establishing piece harmony and bolstering the beleaguered monarch takes precedence now. The bishop's retreat to c7 seeks to untangle the defender's pieces from their current awkward positions and prepare for potential pawn pushes or counterplay on the queen side. Unlocking the g-file opens up audacious attacking avenues toward black's exposed monarch, initiating a daring pawn sacrifice designed to dismantle the defensive screen. Reconnecting the bishop to the queenside defense, this move stabilizes the pawn structure and prepares to contest the file, though it momentarily surrenders the d-file initiative. The king's safety is paramount, and repositioning him to the more open g-file, away from the lurking dark-squared bishop and potential checks on the e-file, offers a measure of immediate protection. This strategic retreat anticipates future threats and prioritizes consolidating the king's position amidst the burgeoning complications. Reclaiming the c-file and preparing to contest it is the immediate goal here. Unleashing a pawn storm, white aims to crack open the kingside and exploit black's compromised queenside structure, threatening to drive forward and smother black's counterplay with sheer material. Re-establishing control over the open files and threatening the white king with immediate tactical consequences defines the spirit of this counterthrust. The monarch scurries to the edge of the board, a precarious relocation driven by the immediate threat of discovery. Snatching that bishop offers immediate material gain, but opens up a precarious diagonal for your king, potentially exposing it to white's rook and queen. The rook's return to the 7th rank solidifies control of that vital open file, aiming to disrupt black's potentially active pieces and prepare for a kingside push. Regaining a piece with tempo, this check forces white's king into a more exposed square, potentially setting up future mating threats or a decisive material advantage by exploiting the open lines now aimed at his monarch. The white king, having shuffled out of immediate danger, now finds itself exposed on the kingside, a prime target for black's remaining pieces, especially that active bishop on c5. White's priority should shift from simply surviving to establishing some defensive setup, perhaps eyeing the f-file for potential counterplay or trying to consolidate pieces for a more resilient defensive posture, as the current piece placement lacks harmony. Unleashing a desperado check, black aims to disrupt white's newly centralized king and perhaps snag an extra pawn, though the exchange of bishops has significantly simplified the position and opened a path for white's rook. The king's desperate flight across the board, now forced to accept capture, exposes its skeleton and leaves the remaining pieces adrift in a sea of potential threats. White's position, though materially ahead, now requires extreme precision to avoid allowing black's queen and knight a dangerous foothold in the weakened central territory. The king's perilous exposure, a consequence of aggressive piece sacrifices, now becomes the undeniable focal point as the rook swings across the board to assert its dominion on the open file. Forking the king and rook, this move injects a sudden jolt of tactical urgency into the position, demanding immediate attention from black's monarch while simultaneously threatening to dismantle their rook defense on the now open f-file. The king, no longer a sanctuary, bravely steps into the heart of the storm, a daring gambit aimed at disrupting the relentless pawn advance and potentially creating counterplay. The bishop's foray to h7 aims to exploit the exposed king by creating potential mating nets. Unveiling the king's retreat and the bishop's daring excursion towards the queenside, this maneuver seeks to activate a dormant piece and potentially disrupt white's centralized control, aiming to exploit the open files for counterplay in a stark, material-imbalanced endgame. A desperate check, attempting to exploit the exposed black king, but it overlooks the immediate threat to white's own monarch, signaling a potentially fatal oversight. Safeguarding the king's retreat to the back rank is paramount after the recent exchange, though the subsequent recapture sequence has drastically altered the material balance and pawn structure. The bishop repositions, aiming to contest the central light squares and prepare for a potential outpost on d5 if the opportunity arises, while also keeping an eye on any immediate threats to the king's safety. Sensing a potential breakthrough, black ventures forward with the pawn to seize open terrain on the queenside, aiming to restrict white's rook and potentially create a passed pawn later. Pushing the b-pawn here offers a new dimension to the endgame, creating a passed pawn that will demand black's attention and potentially liberate the rook on the newly opened b-file, forcing a difficult decision for black's queen. Unleashing a final desperate flourish, the rook charges down the g-file, aiming to disrupt white's now seemingly secure king position and perhaps snatch a pawn before facing inevitable material disadvantage. Pushing the king forward now seems eager, but exposes your monarch to the full fury of black's remaining pieces, potentially leading to an early checkmate if black can activate that bishop effectively. Bringing the rook back into the fray on the kingside creates immediate pressure and aims to disrupt white's somewhat uncoordinated pieces, potentially forcing concessions or opening lines for further counterplay. Reinforcing the king's central security with this move aims to consolidate white's material advantage and prepare for a decisive kingside attack. Securing the bishop's mobility now prevents white from easily exploiting the open diagonal towards black's king, a crucial defensive maneuver in this complex endgame. A timely redeployment of the knight to a more active square, aiming to penetrate the vulnerable kingside. Sacrificing the rook here is a bold attempt to create some chaos and perhaps exploit the exposed white king, but the material deficit is simply too great to overcome this late in the game. White's pieces are far too coordinated, and the pawn structure on the kingside is a solid barrier. Putting your monarch back into the fray offers a surprising avenue for consolidating your advantage, as the open nature of the position now allows the king to participate actively in the defense and potential counterplay. The king bravely ventures back into the fray, seeking active participation in the endgame, though it leaves him exposed to potential checks. Consolidating the bishop's influence on the long diagonal offers a robust defensive structure, aiming to restrict the black rook's activity while preparing for potential pawn advances that could create new attacking avenues. A futile attempt to find activity on the queenside when the immediate threat to the king's safety is paramount. Unleashing the knight to g4 aims to exploit the weakened kingside diagonal, potentially setting up a decisive attack or creating advanced pawn threats. Unleashing the f-pawn like a battering ram cracks open the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's defensive structure and create immediate counterplay. Prying open the kingside with the knight, this maneuver aims to exploit the exposed black monarch and create new attacking possibilities. Re-establishing a defensive posture for the monarch is paramount now that the opponent's knight has found a potentially dangerous outpost. Securing the king becomes paramount as the queens are off the board. Repositioning to the central squares offers better defensive coverage against any potential passed pawn advances or discovered threats. Opening up that queenside flank with a pawn advance offers the bishop a potential escape route and aims to disrupt white's consolidated position. Opening up the queenside pawn structure with this pawn push will allow your rook to become more active on the open file, potentially creating threats against black's isolated pieces. Unleashing a timely rook offers a glimmer of counterplay, disrupting white's control over the open file and potentially forcing awkward exchanges that could alleviate some of black's positional pressure. Injecting a knight into the fray, The knight on f3 seeks to reinforce the central pawn structure and potentially pry open the a-file, creating a new avenue for attack. Black recaptures the pawn, embracing the inevitable endgame transition and aiming to exploit the newly opened diagonals with the remaining pieces. A precise knight repositioning to secure the pawn and create active threats. A desperate attempt to exploit the open king, but the advanced pawn on g5 offers too much protection.